Have tried telling my experience about that house on podcasts, local radios, even on Reddit. Most people thought I made it up, but no, this is my experience, terrifying and full of unanswered questions. I'm still not entirely sure what I encountered that night. All I know is that something violent and dangerous lurks in the darkness of that house, something that left scars on both my body and my soul. And trust me, if you hear a soft whisper in the dark telling you, "I'm sorry," it might be wise to walk away. What I'm about to tell you happened to me 7 years ago. I had just moved into this century-old house that I'd inherited from a distant relative. It was one of those fixer-uppers that you see in movies, the kind that make you think, yeah, it's got character. The neighborhood was quiet, maybe too quiet. I would say that I'm not what you'd call a superstitious person. I like my rational explanations, my logic, my sense that every creak or sound of an old house is just, old wood settling. But one night, it all changed. It was a rainy evening on Wednesday or Thursday, can't remember really. I was working late at home, trying to sort through some old documents in the living room, when I started to hear something odd, a rhythmic tapping coming from downstairs. At first, I figured it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch hitting the window. But then I noticed it wasn't coming from outside at all. It was from the basement. Now, I knew that the basement door was always locked up, partly because I'd never bothered to explore it thoroughly, and partly because, well, there was something unnerving about that heavy creaking door, but that sound I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my small Nokia phone, fired up the phone's flashlight, and trust me, that old flashlight did little to chase away the darkness, and headed down the creaky wooden stairs. The basement was exactly what you'd expect from a house built 100 years ago. Low ceilings, weird odor, and a darkness that felt almost alive. I looked around until my eyes adjusted to the gloom. Old furniture, stacks of boxes, and a jumble of broken trinkets were scattered about. But there was something else too, in creepy silence disrupted by the repeated drip of water, and that persistent tapping sound echoing somewhere in the back. I couldn't shake the weird feeling about the basement. Every instinct told me to turn around and bolt up the stairs, yet curiosity pushed me forward. I followed the sound down a narrow hallway that I'd never noticed before. The air grew colder, and then I started feeling some kind of way as if I was not the only in the basement. I kept thinking, okay, this is ridiculous. It's just an old house, right? But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then I came upon a door tucked behind a stack of battered crates. It was slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see a sliver of a room I'd never seen. Something about it made my heart race, like I'm about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I pushed the door open slowly, my hand shaking so much that I nearly dropped my phone. Inside, the room was small, almost like a forgotten storage space. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper and dark stains that I couldn't immediately identify. In the middle of the room was an old wooden table. On it lay a bundle of yellowed papers and what looked unmistakably like dried blood. I'm not one to jump to supernatural conclusions, but the sight of that blood made me feel unsafe. I picked up one of the papers. The handwriting was unstable and rough, almost like a wild sketch. It mentioned names, dates, and words I couldn't quite piece together. At the bottom was a weird phrase, repent or suffer the curse. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, almost as if someone was speaking directly into my ear. I spun around to check, but the room was empty. I'm not saying I believed in ghosts before, but at that moment I couldn't help but wonder if I'd just inherited a nightmare. I started backing out of the room when I heard soft footsteps behind me. I froze. The tapping noise increased, now coming from the far corner of the hidden room. I was scared, and I struggled to keep my voice steady as I whispered, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response, only the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps drawing nearer. In a split second, I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. I looked down and saw that I'd stepped on a loose floorboard, but that wasn't all. It felt like something had grabbed me, as if an invisible hand was pulling me back. I kicked out reflexively, wincing in pain, and managed to break free. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. I'll never forget it, a tall, gaunt figure that seemed to float rather than walk. The figure's face was hidden in shadow. It didn't move with the jerky, unnatural motions you'd expect from a movie ghost. It moved with a deliberate, almost human gait, When it stopped in front of me, I swear I could see the glint of something metallic in its hand. A knife, perhaps. I tried to speak, but my voice was stuck in my throat. The figure didn't speak either, just stood there, eyes locked on mine. The only sound was my heavy breathing and the relentless tapping of water dripping somewhere unseen. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, it murmured, "I'm sorry." That single sentence echoed in my ears, filled with such profound sorrow that for a split second, I felt pity even in the midst of terror. I don't know how long it lasted, but in what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly backed away, vanishing into the shadows of the room as if it had never been there at all. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened. Was it a ghost, a hallucination, or had my mind finally cracked under the pressure of isolation? I turned to run back toward the stairs. But as soon as I reached the end of the narrow hallway, I discovered that the door to the main basement area was inexplicably jammed. I tugged and yanked at the door, my heart pounding, but it wouldn't budge. That's when I realized I was trapped. Panic set in as I banged on the door, screaming for help, though I knew deep down that no one would hear me down here. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and I felt as if unseen hands were closing in on me. A lot was going through my mind at that moment. I was like, is this the end? How will I escape? I then spot a narrow window near the ceiling, partially hidden behind old pipes. It wasn't much, but it was my only chance. I scrambled over a pile of old crates and furniture, every movement accompanied with the thought that this could be the end of it all. I managed to wedge myself through the grimy window, and after a few tense moments of crawling through darkness, I finally tumbled out into the cool night air of the backyard. I didn't stop running until I was safely back inside the house, though I never dared set foot in the basement again that night. The next morning, bruised and sore from my ordeal, my ankle was throbbing and my shoulder was tender, with scratches I hadn't noticed until I looked closely in a mirror. I sat down with my laptop to research the history of Haunted House. What I found was both fascinating and horrifying. There were several accounts from different residents and neighbors about strange noises, unexplainable shadows, and even violent incidents that had occurred over the decades. Of course, I wasn't entirely convinced that ghosts were real, but after what I experienced, it was hard to dismiss the possibility. What really shook me, though, was that a few days later, I received a text message from an unknown number. The message was simple, a short audio clip. Hesitantly, I played it. In a whisper that I recognized all too well from that night in the basement came the words, "I'm sorry." It was as if that sorrowful presence was reaching out to me, reminding me that I'd seen more than just shadows down there. I started to wonder if I was simply imagining things, if my mind was playing tricks on me after a long day of stress and fatigue. But then, small things began to happen around the house. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft footsteps in the hall, and sometimes I'd find objects move just slightly out of place. I even found that same cryptic note, "Repent or suffer the curse," scribbled on a scrap of paper tucked into a book I had left on the table. Every time I looked at that note, I felt that same bone-deep chill. I tried to rationalize it all. Maybe it was just the stress of the move. Maybe the house's history was affecting my sleep. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something violent and dangerous had been unleashed that night, something that wasn't ready to let go. A few weeks later, after barely sleeping and plagued by nightmares of that basement, I decided I needed real answers. I reached out to an old friend who worked in local law enforcement, someone who had a reputation for digging into unsolved cases. Over coffee at a local diner, I recounted everything: the tapping sounds, the hidden room, the figure with the knife, and the creepy apology. He listened intently, his face growing more serious by the minute. "You know," he said quietly, "there have been whispers about that house for decades. People have reported violent incidents in the basement, and a few even claim to have seen that same figure." He went on to explain that a series of unsolved murders had been linked to that very property. One victim had even written a confession in blood on the wall of a hidden room, much like what I described for him. I left that conversation with more questions than answers. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss it all as an overactive imagination because I was leaving alone in a creepy old building. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could still hear those soft, regretful whispers echoing in my mind. Then came the night I nearly lost it all. It was nearly a month after that initial encounter. I'd been trying to settle back into a normal routine, though every sound and shadow in the house reminded me of that basement. I couldn't sleep well, and the nightmares had only gotten worse. I remember having one particular dream. It was so real that I woke up drenched in sweat, showed me the figure, standing over me, its eyes filled with both malice and despair. I remember waking up with a start, my heart racing. I was already losing it. So I decided to confront whatever it was that haunted me, or if it was just my imagination. I decided to go back down to the basement, armed with nothing more than a flashlight, a crowbar, and a determination to find closure. I remember thinking, this is insane, but I have to do it. I told myself that if I could understand what had happened, maybe I could finally put it to rest. The descent felt creepily familiar, like I was about to relive that night again. When I reached the basement, I stopped at the top of the stairs, took a deep breath before walking into another possible nightmare. I heard the tapping sound again like the older night, more frequent than before. I retraced my steps along the narrow hallway, this time with a resolve I hadn't felt before. I arrived at the hidden room once more. The table, the bloodstains, and that cryptic note, it was all still there, exactly as I remembered. I was getting really scared, but I forced myself to stay calm. I began searching the room for anything that might explain everything going on. In one of the drawers, I discovered a tattered journal. The pages were filled with ramblings about guilt, penance, and violent urges. It seemed to be written by the man who once lived there, a man who had been tormented by his own actions. I cannot escape the curse of my own making. The basement is my tomb and my confession. Each drop of blood spilled is a reminder that I must pay for my sins. May those who disturb my rest find redemption, or be consumed by the darkness I have unleashed. I don't know if it was meant as a plea for forgiveness or a final deranged rant, but as I read it, I felt a presence behind me, a cold, heavy presence that made me feel unsafe. I turned slowly, half expecting to see the figure from before. Instead, I found the doorway empty, the only movement the flickering of my flashlight across peeling wallpaper. Suddenly, from the far end of the room, I heard it, a soft, labored whisper that was unmistakably clear. Repent. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it would burst. I spun around and saw a flash of movement in the dark corner. Before I could react, something lunged from the shadows. I felt a searing pain in my shoulder as if a sharp object had grazed me. I screamed and stumbled back, dropping the journal. The flash of movement was gone in an instant, leaving only a trail of whispered apologies in its wake. I scrambled to my feet. I didn't think about it twice. I ran for the stairs. The basement door, which had been my escape route before, was now blocked by a figure I couldn't clearly make out. A twisted shape, moving with unnatural speed. I swung the crowbar wildly, connecting with something solid, and heard a cry. In that moment, I wasn't sure if I was dealing with a ghost or a very disturbed person, hidden in the dark recesses of the house. I managed to break free, nearly tripping over debris as I raced up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, in the cold, damp night air, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I collapsed on the front steps, shaking uncontrollably, every nerve in my body screaming that I had come too close to something I wasn't meant to understand. I spent the following days in a fog of shock and pain. My shoulder was bruised and my ankle still ached from that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me even in broad daylight. I eventually had the house inspected by professionals, and while they found no logical explanation for the locked door or the unexplained injuries, I couldn't let them tell me it was all in my head. I eventually moved out of that house, selling it quickly, though not without a lingering sense of guilt and curiosity. I often wonder what truly happened down there. Was it the tortured spirit of a man haunted by his crimes? Or was it something or someone far more sinister that used the guise of a ghost to hide its own violent nature? Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I hear that faint tapping or the soft whisper of, "I'm sorry," and I can't help but shudder, remembering the basement that changed my life forever. Thanks for listening to my story. I hope you take care out there and maybe, just maybe, give a little extra thought before exploring the unknown corners of an old house. Stay safe.